My dear friends, thank you for being here. My father is a hard act to follow. After that powerful video, I'm going to do my best to avoid being an anticlimax. First of all, can I ask James Cha, and who put that video together in 2.5 days, to please stand up. James, where are you? There we are. Thank you, James. And can I thank Dr. Lee Swan Yu, Bishop Solomon, unfortunately is unable to be here. He's just back from surgery. Dr. K.K. Ong, and Dr. Puvanendran, who unfortunately has to be at a conference in Australia today. The work that my father did has recently been acknowledged by Professor Mary Dobson, who was previously of the Oxford University as a medical historian, and is now a medical historian at Cambridge, as having saved not just thousands of lives, which is what the book refers to, but in subsequent decades, since the 50s and 60s, when he did that work, in subsequent decades, she says that it's probably saved millions of lives around the world, because that treatment which he prototyped has become the gold standard in many countries in the third world. Mrs. Jean Marshall rang me today, and we had a chat. She's 93, and she's widow of our first Chief Minister, David Marshall. She so wanted to be here today, but is unwell and sends her regrets. What she said was that it would be fine for me today to say that her husband, David, actually had tuberculosis as a little boy when he was 10 or 11, and had to go off in those days to Switzerland for treatment, because there was no treatment here as such, and there was very little even abroad, and he had to be in a sanatorium for almost a year. So when David became our first Chief Minister in 1955, he and then Governor Sir William Goode implemented a program called Malayanization, which I think many of you may have heard about. It was a process by which locals would start taking on responsibilities from the British in certain departments and gradually take over the running of the civil service. And they picked, in fact it was David and William Goode together, who picked my father to go to the UK to do research and work and further studies in tuberculosis. It's only now that I realize why actually David had a particular vested interest and connection with tuberculosis. The video we've seen portrays a public man, healing hands, giving heart, acute intellect, and someone who made a difference. But he was a very unassuming person who actually never sought to be recognized or fame or fortune. In fact, until he retired, he never had a house registered in his name. We lived in my mother's house, given by my grandfather, maternal. And because of that, I think he doesn't even have a Wikipedia page now, and yet the work he did was seminal. In that interview that was done in the 70s, he described himself as a senior registrar. He was actually at the time a head of department and an acting consultant in 58. But that was typical of the man. He always understated what he did. What we do know as a fact is that in that year he was just 36, and we were a crown colony, and he convinced the British authorities to implement those 3 programs, and that made a big difference. So I would say he was a quiet person of conviction who made a difference. Permit me now to say a little bit, though, about the man I knew simply as Dad, and what influenced him to become the person that he was, a servant of the people. That video just now ended with a lovely little voice. That was a recording of my father's eldest sister, Rose, done in the 1930s. She was an opera singer. The words were, "O thou whose love and mercy." And I think it was actually pretty poignant. Dad loved music, Western and Tamil lyrics, but that was one of his favorite. Because God's love and mercy and providence made a difference to his life and filled him with hope. O thou whose love and mercy, and it talks about hope. And he needed that hope. He needed to be an optimist, because He lost his mother at the age of 2 and his father at 15, so he was orphaned from the age of 15. Never knew a mother. His elder sister, the one who was the singer, became his de facto mother. From his grandfather, my grandfather, his father, he learned resilience and fortitude. Grandpa was a widower in his early 40s with 7 young children, aged 1 to 14. And he brought them up and gave them an education, holding 3 concurrent jobs. He was headmaster of different ACS schools in Malaya, Methodist minister, and he was also the district superintendent of 3 Malayan states, Pahang, Selangor, and Negeri Sembilan. My father was the 6th of his 7 children, 6th of the 7 who lived. There were 2 others who died young. Father was born in 1921, and by 1931, the 5 elder ones were away at college. And so my father had to then accompany Grandpa on his visits as district superintendent into the remote villages in the jungles, visiting schools, village heads, workers. And at age 10, Grandpa put my father in charge of those expeditions, which meant in those days lights, sticks, parangs, to ward off the animals, because they had just a little baby Austin. And if they got stuck because of the rain, he had to miss school the next day and still keep his place near the top. So the second influence on him was resilience and to have no fear and to learn to work with older people in authority. The third influence was faith, which he learnt from his father. Grandfather came here as an orphan at the age of 12 on a boat in 1892 in charge of a little 6-year-old sister. They both came to be a ward of my grandfather's uncle. 2 years later, Grandfather, whilst at ACS, converted to Christianity from being a devout Hindu and was disinherited, thrown out of the family, actually literally put on the streets. ACS missionaries took him in, became a student, he became a boarder at Oldham House, and his younger sister was also thrown out of the house and she went to MGS boarding, 900 boarding. God was faithful to them. Grandpa made good, as I mentioned just now, and faith underpinned him. The fourth key influence on Dad was that he cheated death during World War II. He was shelled giving a Christian burial on the 14th of February 1942. The shell miraculously only pierced his leg, front to back, but 10 others who were with him were killed instantly. The next day the British surrendered Singapore. Dad's elder brother George was a doctor, and many thought the brightest in the family, was not so lucky. He died in 1944 during the Japanese occupation. He had been secretly, as a doctor, working in Kuching General Hospital. He'd been slipping away to help British prisoners of war at the Batu Lintang camp. So losing George, surviving being hit by a shell, and himself not getting caught, my father, when after his war injuries he was involved in helping to smuggle medicines for British POWs, gave him a conviction that his life was meant to count in service to his fellow men. I learned some lessons from him, and what were those lessons? I think the first was second chances. He felt he had been given a second chance in life, and he went out of his way to help those needing second chances, but first he wanted to check that the cause was worthy. One beneficiary was Liang Tongdao, one of our senior mandarins. I discovered this quite by chance at the christening of Mr. J.Y.M. Pillai's younger grandson William at the Pyramid Club about 20 years ago. Mr. Nyam came up and shook my father's hand very vigorously, and I wondered why, and then he called me aside and said, "Do you know your father actually went out of his way to certify me fit? I'd had tuberculosis and the admin service wouldn't take me in. And because he was so strenuous in making sure that I was cleared and then vouching for me, I was able to join the admin service." The rest, as they say, of course, is history. Nyang Tongdao went on to become our youngest permanent secretary and a great guru of the economic growth that we've enjoyed. I was also such a beneficiary. I was medically downgraded at OCS. I had torn menisci and a back injury. And I went back to see him after a bit of treatment and said, can you help me get back into OCS? He wanted to know why, whether I was just wanting a higher rank or whether it was service of the nation. So we had a conversation, and I told him I thought Fall of Saigon, domino theory, etc. And after he was convinced, and also convinced that I could go through OCS with a bad back and torn menisci, a medical board was arranged. It wouldn't happen today, I fear. And I was upgraded, and I was able to get through senior term on painkillers with my back and knees strapped up. At the commissioning, in those days, in the 70s, it was at the Istana, we had a commissioning dinner, he was quietly pleased. I could see it in his eyes. He had given me a second chance, and so I then carried on serving as a reservist for 16 years after the normal cutoff of 40, simply because he had given me a chance. There was a silver lining to it, because just after that, he very kindly said, I'm going to get you a car, an Alfa Romeo. He liked fast cars as well. But he knew my mother would never allow it. So what he did was he surprised her with the Alfa Romeo that's actually upstairs. We thought we had to bring it today. And said, darling, I've got this lovely car for you. And she said, Julie, you know I can barely drive a Morris Minor. How do you expect me to drive this Alfa Romeo? And he said, well, I can't give it back now. We can't. I bought it. Why don't we let Paul have it? And so that's how I ended up having the Alfa Romeo that's upstairs. It's one of the last Julias left in Singapore. And he and I would go on drives. Second chances. Another lesson I learned from him was endurance. He was dogged. He never gave up. He applied the middle distance runner's philosophy. He was an athlete. Quarter miler, half miler. You keep going, you have to be tactical, pace yourself, and know when to sprint, knowing when to land a punch. When I was 6, he made me learn that heights of great men earned and kept were not by sudden flight attained, but they, while their compatriots slept, were toiling onwards through the night. An interesting and important quote I've always remembered. He was organized. Even pleasure time for him was focused. Even at concerts, we had to look at music, orchestral scores. And then he said, you must have gumption, you must have courage. He was tenacious. He rebuilt that right leg that had a hole in it and became a champion athlete at university, captained soccer, took part in the Slango in Singapore AAA. And as children, we used to have a fascination poking his leg, because we could go right through from the front to the back. And then I think the grandchildren did the same, my children. But it was tenacity, hole in the leg, and he was going to become a champion athlete. Like his father, who had given him responsibility at the age of 10, he wanted us also to have responsibility. So at 12, he was going back to Geneva. He had been in Geneva in 64 with the WHO, and in 69 he was going back, and we were doing a massive house project. And he said, I'm putting you in charge to help Mum. Gave me a lesson on the difference between columns and beams, how to read architectural plans, and simple discussions about a budget. Later in 1983, a more serious occurrence, there was civil war in the north of Ceylon, and he rang me where I was just finished in Cambridge and was going off to law school, and said, your maternal grandmother is in danger. I want you to go in and get her out. You're an officer in the Singapore Army. You should be able to do it. My cousins in the south didn't want to go from Colombo to Jaffna. So I went in, managed to get north, and she was a stubborn lady, and we managed to get her out, bundled out of the house while the Civil War was going on. It came to be called, actually, a pretty awful time. It was called Black July in Sri Lanka that year. And we got it to Singapore. So he expected from us courage. He also wanted us to have an inquisitive mind. He played mental chess both sides of the board. And I had to learn bridge at the age of 11 and remember every 51 of the 52 cards. Minister Ong Ye Kung said in a speech last week after the World Skills Competition in Kazan that a new template in education is necessary in this fast-changing world with artificial intelligence. Learn some things extremely well, draw connections and synergies, and then produce a meaningful outcome. That's what he did with TV. He wanted us to have a love of history. As a child, I used to meet some of the old relatives in Jaffna, and one day he said, you're coming with me to Palali Airport. And coming off the plane was Chelvanayagam, the great founder of the Tamil movement in Ceylon, the Tamil Congress. Another time, as a child, he arranged for me to be on a little excursion, and I met Mr. Gokeng Sui, which he had kindly arranged. And he said, "You'll remember this, you're meeting a great man." And finally, he had sympathy, kindness, anti-elitism, as you heard, and he was incisive. I had a bad tummy thing, and it occurred almost immediately. I was 5, 1962, and my mother thought I was making a fuss. She finally called him. He listened to the symptoms, came home and rushed me to hospital. I was operated on immediately, and the appendix perforated while they were operating, but he saved my life. And then he bought me a pedal jeep. This is what I really remember. The rules were that you couldn't run along the corridors, and we were a colony, and he said to the matron, "Please allow him to drive his jeep, because it's good for his therapy." So I remember that with fondness rather than the pain. He'd have sometimes male Indian nurses, dressers, hospital dressers, and staff come home for an evening of sati, which my mother would arrange. And he'd sit there in a singlet and in his sarong and talk to them, listen to them, and then he'd make calls sometimes if their children had a worthy cause to get them into better schools, encouraging them to believe in societal upliftment. And he always gave them lessons on sort of lectures, don't smoke. And when he went to Komalas and other restaurants, and they would welcome him and say, "Look, please come up to the air-conditioned room," he'd say, "No, no, no, we sit with everybody else," with a big smile. The old order changeth, yielding place to new, and God fulfills himself in many ways. I've lived my life, and that which I have done may he within himself make pure. But if thou shouldst never see my face again, pray for myself. More things are wrought by prayer than this world dreams of. But now farewell. These were amongst his last words from his favourite poem just before he died, Morte Arthur, by Alfred Lord Tennyson. And I thought they're quite poignant. Thank you all. And I now have the pleasure of asking Minister Kaur, who worked with my father, to come up and say some words. Thank you.